All right. I wanted to follow up the last article post I made in First Peter. We were looking at First Peter chapter 3 and verses sort of 13 to the end, and looking at a section that um, can cause and has caused a lot of tension in biblical interpretation, and has some confusing moments and aspects to it. And one of those sort of confusing moments and aspects we get in First Peter chapter 3, verse 19. He's been talking, or he just started talking about the fact that Jesus was crucified and he died, but he was made alive in the Spirit. I'll read you the verse. It says this. I'll start in 18. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience. And the text carries on. I want to talk about, I mentioned briefly the baptism stuff in the article, and that is really just a brief treatment of sort of what's going on in that text. But I wanted to talk about this idea of the spirits in prison, because this is, it's odd. We're trying to sort it out and make sense of it. And there's a few options as far as the history of interpreting this passage is concerned, and options in the traditions and teachings of the church across the centuries. But then I kind of want to get to something that I think narrows it down and really clarifies what might be happening in that particular passage, because of some of the mentions that are in that particular text and in the letter of First Peter as a whole. So let's do this. The first, just because of the way that I'm going to treat it here, they're not sort of ranked here, but the first option, as we look at this, when we want to talk about the spirits in prison, quote unquote, one of the historic interpretations for the spirits in prison in the letter of First Peter is individuals who have died prior to some event in history. A lot of the time, because we talk about God's patience waited in the days of Noah, a lot of the time those individuals are described as individuals who have died prior to Noah's flood. They could also be described as individuals who passed away and are sort of being held prior to the death of Christ, in which then Jesus goes to them and preaches. In either case of this particular text, these are souls who are waiting for Jesus to come and proclaim the gospel to them. And the basic understanding for most of what I've encountered in individuals that hold this is that they then would respond to the truth of the gospel brought to them by Jesus, as they would have in the life that they already led. So somebody like Abraham would respond with joy and gratitude in seeing the promises of God fulfilled in the Messiah that he now gets to sort of see in a way, in this spiritual way. And then they would go from there on to paradise or their punishment, or fill in the blank, as a kind of, now that Christ has come, they can be ushered forward into the places of their afterlife. That's an interesting one. And really that interpretation rests and hinges completely on the word choice for prison. Because the word choice for prison there is this captivity. And given that the text here mentions spirits that are in prison, sorry about that. Given that the text mentions spirits that are in prison, the first sort of assumption and the first, well, okay, so spirits in prison would be some sort of afterlife, some sort of perhaps holding cell, some sort of eternal punishment, some sort of something like that, because that is what we tend to think of when we think of spirits and a prison. On the other hand, and this is more in line with sort of what I'm thinking, and this has been conversations with past professors and poring over this passage and trying to sort out the context. But he says in 3:19, made alive in the spirit in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared. Okay, so I think what's happening in verse 20 is those who did not obey in the days of Noah while he was preparing the ark are the individuals being referred to in the proclamation to the spirits in prison, which means that prison here, I think, is a play on words. I think it's the prison of their own sin and delusion. While Noah is preparing the ark for the flood, these individuals sort of scoff and laugh, perhaps, or don't take him seriously, or don't pay any attention, and they're blinded by their own sort of wanton sin and fill in the blank, which is the state of the world leading up to this, right? God says that the end of humanity has come up before him in the sin of the earth leading up to the flood, and now he has to deal with it in Noah's flood. And so he prepares Noah with the ark. And the spirits then would be these particular individuals. The issue that you have to understand then as you do that is that the one making the proclamation is Christ, Jesus, in the Spirit. Remember, 18 says he was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit. And then 19 starts with in which, in other words, in the Spirit, he went and proclaimed to spirits in prison in the days of Noah. Okay. That corresponds to what happened in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 11, where Peter mentions that it's the Spirit of Christ who inspired the prophets to proclaim the truth of the good news, to deliver the messages of God, and fill in blank. And so Noah would be considered one of those as he faithfully prepares the ark and warns his generation. Something that Peter's going to pick up in the second Peter letter when he talks about Noah as a prophet who proclaimed the truth. So I think what we're looking at in this sort of odd mention of spirits in prison is the Spirit of Christ inspiring Noah to proclaim the truth of God's salvation to the spirits of his generation who are in prison because of the sin and the condition of the world that we see in Genesis 6 leading up to the flood. Not necessarily some sort of spiritual state or afterlife state in which Jesus goes to the realm of the dead or something like that to proclaim the gospel to those who've already died. Both of these readings, however, have been around in the church for a long period of time. And we have to sort through them. Like I said before, the idea that it's spirits in prison is sort of that is the question mark here. What do we mean by spirits who are in prison? Do we mean people who have passed away and are now awaiting the resurrection, and that is the kind of prison that we're talking about? Or do we mean individuals, spirits, who are in a more metaphorical kind of prison, or a more in the condition of their sin kind of prison, as opposed to well, we're holding you here in this cell prior to your sort of eternal and final destination, if you will. But that you got to work through what's going on in that phrase. I think the key to understanding it is what happens in verse 20 that follows it, where in verse 20 he says God's patience waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared. So it seems that the 8 persons saved through water and the ark being prepared is a reference to the time frame that we're looking at for these spirits who were in prison. Okay, I just wanted to touch on that because I thought it was sort of an interesting note. I hope you guys are having a good day, and we'll talk again. We'll talk again soon as we continue through 1 Peter. God bless.